Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our post-election economic update with Anirban Basu. Before we begin today, as it is Veterans Day, we want to give a big thank you to all of our veterans out there and to all of you who have friends and family on active duty. With that, Anirban, the floor is yours.
Righto, Marty, I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you again to Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, and Marty in particular for inviting me, and thanks to you for being here on this Veterans Day. And I, like you, commemorate Veterans Day, and thank you to all those veterans for your service to this great nation. So, it's a post-election economic update, and so one might say, well, the key word there is election or post-election. But we'll also talk about the economy and where we are in the cycle, and I'll blend in some political information along with the economic data. Today's presentation is entitled Castaway. It's based on Tom Hanks movies. Actually, is the theme of today's presentation. Castaway was a movie that came out in the year 2000. And it starred people like, of course, Tom Hanks, but Chris Noth, who played Big on Sex and the City, and also a gritty detective on Law and Order, and many others. But the main leading, or I should say the main supporting actor was the volleyball Wilson here, who for my money was the best supporting actor of 2000. But in any case, it did not get the nomination. So, but let's talk about the economy, where we are. Of course, it's Tom Hanks themed, and I think this is an appropriate saying. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. We certainly did not know that we were going to get this in 2020, did we? Because we came into the year with so much momentum. You'll remember, adding jobs in January, more than 200,000 that month, adding 251,000 jobs in February, enjoying a 3.5% rate of unemployment, a 50-year low. So much momentum coming into 2020. The stock market was booming, setting new all-time highs back in February. Just it felt pretty great, didn't it, macroeconomically? But like Tom Hanks said, or Forrest Gump at least, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And we got COVID-19, and that shattered that pre-existing equilibrium. And as I've said before, and I'll say it again, one of the keys to getting through this pandemic is to try to distinguish what to believe from what not to believe. And one of the things I had heard early in the crisis was that the virus is not like warm temperatures. The virus just does just fine in warm climates. And recently we've seen surges in places like India, Brazil, Mexico, and of course, Florida, Arizona, Texas. But the virus does fine in cold temperatures too. It's impacted people wherever they live. Now, some nations have done a bit better than others handling this. Taiwan, for instance, last I checked, 7 deaths in a nation of 23 million people. Hong Kong has held up pretty well from a viral perspective, perhaps not a political one. South Korea also has fared reasonably well during this crisis. Some nations have done better than others, and China, ironically, will grow economically this year. But of course, in America, the situation is very different. This is US COVID-19 daily cases. Now, I'll talk about the fact that the recovery since roughly late April has been quite brisk. I'll talk about that. But, the hope had been that we would have flattened the curve more fully over the course of many months of sacrifice. So as we shut down the economy in March and April, those of you from Maryland might remember we shut down this economy around March 13th. And we, in fact, begin to see that curve. This is, again, daily cases. The red line is the 7-day average. We see that curve flatten. And it's a beautiful thing. We're making it happen, and that flattening lasts until mid-June. But then what happens? Here comes the summer surge in Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Southern California. And this follows, of course, economic reopenings. The first economy to reopen was in Georgia under the leadership of Governor Brian Kemp. He opened up his economy on April 20th. And then shortly thereafter, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, follows suit. And I'm not saying that these things are related, but perhaps they are. It doesn't strike one as purely coincidental, but you can see that summer surge there in terms of infection rates. And so a lot of that progress undoing the flattening, a lot of that progress of flattening the curve is undone. And that lasts until around mid to late July. Then you can see whether it's because we're wearing more masks or more aggressively social distancing, we flatten the curve again. But then a few days after Labor Day, another spike begins, and you can see this surge here. If you look at, again, that red line, the skinny blue-colored bars are daily cases, and it's parabolic. And here we are on, in mid-November, and the temperatures are going to get colder and colder and colder into February, and then, and I suppose it start warming in March. But pretty grim outlook from a public health perspective. You've heard that medical cases or COVID-19 cases are up in Maryland, have been for the last week or so pretty aggressively. Hospitalizations are up. Hospitals in Green Bay, Wisconsin, as early as about 3 or 4 weeks ago, were overwhelmed with COVID-19 patients. Now, we've also had an election. And I think the title of the presentation was a post-election economic update. However, it's not obvious to me that we're in the post-election period. It seems as if the election might still be taking place. And indeed, in some ways it is, in some ways it's not. But it might matter, where the candidates stand. Now, if you accept the premise that the inauguration will involve one Joseph Biden as opposed to a Donald Trump, what are the differences between Joe Biden and Trump in terms of, let's say, this first category, reopening the economy? Well, Joe Biden is cautious. I mean, you've seen him wear masks, aggressively, and, social distance and so on and so forth. No criticism regarding that. COVID-19 is a serious thing. But Donald Trump, of course, has embraced a different attitude toward the crisis. Now, if we are seeing this surge in cases, COVID-19 cases, and a president is inaugurated on January 20th who is very cautious, you might see some federal actions to start shutting down the economy on top of the state actions that we have seen. Those of you who pay attention know that in Maryland, Governor Larry Hogan, for instance, yesterday implemented some more restrictions, some more social distancing directives. So this is an issue. Now, what about putting the economy back on track? Joe Biden favors, and Kamala Harris, a massive stimulus package, trillions of dollars of additional stimulus, including spending to create clean energy, manufacturing, caregiving jobs, and to deal with issues of racial inequality, so on and so forth, but big stimulus. Donald Trump, or at least the Republican Party under Donald Trump, favored a one-time stimulus, perhaps before inauguration, perhaps after inauguration. And one of those forms of stimulus might be a payroll tax cut, an interesting proposition. But generally speaking, I would say Joe Biden has announced bigger numbers in terms of future stimulus. Now, we'll talk about the Senate in a second. It's actually a few minutes from now. But this is, again, getting at what the president-elect, again, if you accept that to be Joseph Biden, seeks to implement. He wants to raise the minimum wage and reverse some of the 2017 tax cuts. Donald Trump, of course, says no to raising taxes, wants to keep those late 2017 tax cuts in place. On trade, I think that Joseph Biden would re-engage the rest of the world. You'd see fewer trade wars, for instance, but both candidates want to boost domestic manufacturing. And Joe Biden has proposed his own Made in America manufacturing plan, and that plan would spend about $700 billion on American-made products and industrial research. And he has also criticized Donald Trump's trade war on China. And so you could imagine that America would be more aggressive in its participation with the World Trade Organization, with Paris environmental treaties, and so on and so forth, the Paris Accords. And then green investments. Little appetite on the Trump side for green investments. Lots of appetite on the Joe Biden side of things. $2 trillion over 4 years. Now do some of the math here. So I got $700 billion here. I got $2 trillion over here. I mean, money is starting to add up in terms of the spending. Again, I'm not criticizing. It's for you to determine whether you think these policy objectives are good or bad. That's not for me to suggest. All I'm trying to do is point out that there are, of course, major distinctions between the two candidates. And some of you would say the election is over, of course, but anyway, I suppose these things will be decided in the courts. But there are other issues, of course, beyond what I've talked about. What about healthcare? So, as you know, there are ongoing efforts to repeal Obamacare, but not by Joe Biden. Joe Biden would try to expand, I think, those healthcare exchanges created under Obamacare. Both seek to lower drug prices. That seems to be popular politically and maybe economically necessary. Now, Joseph Biden seeks Medicare and Medicaid expansion. Well, that's going to cost money because the Medicare Trust Fund is set to go insolvent in 2026. Donald Trump has said no to Medicare expansion, and as it turns out, even at its current size, we're going to have to put a lot more money into Medicare, even if we don't expand it. And of course, the demographics of America are such that people are living longer, of course, and we embrace that, we love that. but also more boomers are approaching their retirement years. And some, of course, now are in their 70s. Climate change. Trump is not a fan of climate plans or tougher auto emission rules or ban on coal or fracking. But of course, the Democrats under Joseph Biden are much more about implementing a climate plan, tougher auto emission rules, generally speaking, a more rigorous or rigid regulatory environment. Again, not to say that's good or bad, that's up to you as a Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston stakeholder. But there are differences, and it has consequences for certain industries in the economy. In terms of foreign policy, of course, Donald Trump's mantra has been America first. Joseph Biden would probably take us back a little bit to a more post-World War II kind of environment when we're trying to bring nations together, pledges to restore global leadership in organizations like the World Health Organization and NATO and the World Trade Organization, so on and so forth. And so, big differences here. Now, let me get back to the economy. So, very early in the crisis, I delivered some information on behalf of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston. And at that point, we're trying to predict what was going to happen. And one of the things we focused on in that webinar was a report that came out from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, came out on March 24th, so relatively early days in the crisis, asking the question, who was vulnerable to layoff? Now you say, Anirban, that's March 24th. Sir, we're now in November. Why are you bringing this back up? Because we're going to shut down the economy again, potentially at least. Which means that the workers who were vulnerable during this first set of shutdowns in March and April become vulnerable to layoff once again. So this Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis study encompassed 144.7 million jobs. If you look at the first bolded row here, employed in occupations at low risk of layoff, 54%, essential industries, people who can work from home. One of the things that we have learned over the course of the crisis is that 37% of Americans, 37%, can work purely from home. They can do everything they need to do on the job from home, 37%. To me, that's a big number, but it's actually not this big surprise. The big surprise is that many of these people working from home are more productive working from home than in the office. That's the big surprise over the course of this pandemic. Because as it turns out, there are a few distractions at work. So you get into work, it's been a lengthy, stressful commute. Now you start contemplating co-workers. You go to the water cooler to start talking about your co-workers with other co-workers. Maybe you have some water. Then comes the coffee break, another coffee break, and then you have to fill out your NCAA bracket 4 or 5 times because you're trying to win. And then, and then you get dragged into impromptu meetings. Not to suggest that there aren't distractions at home. Of course there are. We know what they are. Children, the cat, the dog, so on and so forth, the neighbors. But the statistics suggest that in many instances, people are more productive working from home. Well, that has all kinds of implications for the way in which we'll work post-pandemic, but also for commercial real estate, including, of course, the demand for office space. Now, if you look at the second bolded row here, employed in occupations at high risk of layoff, 46%. This is your food preparation workers. So who's probably about to lose a lot of jobs? Restaurant workers. Who else is it? Retail sales. That's that sales category. That's your retail worker. Who's about to probably lose a lot of jobs? Certainly after the holiday shopping season. So we might see some more employment right now in retail as we're in the midst of that Christmas shopping season. But then shortly thereafter, what's going to happen? Retailers might say, look, the economy is shutting down. Spending power is going to decline. If people aren't going to come to the store, I'm going to have to lay off some staff. So I know we've been adding jobs quite significantly over the course of the last few months. I'll talk about that, but the dynamics are changing because the virus has come back with such a vengeance. Gross domestic product, quarterly GDP. Now, the blue-colored bars stretch through 2019. The red-colored bars encompass and that's at the end of the series, the first, second, and third quarters of 2020. So the recession begins in February, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. The crisis, I would argue, begins in March. In fact, I would say March 9th in particular, because that's the day that the Dow Jones fell more than 2,000 points. And at that time, that was a daily point decline record on the Dow. We set new daily point decline records on the Dow on March 12th, and then again on March 16th. Dow Jones goes from 29,000 and change to 18,000 a blink of an eye. Where are we today? 29,494.11. Near an all-time high. So whether you're looking at financial markets or gross domestic product, which I'm showing you here, the early phase of recovery was quite dramatic. We shrank 5% on an annualized basis during the first quarter. The red colored bars are indexed to the right-hand axis, the blue colored bars to the left-hand axis. So as I say, we shrink 5% on an annualized basis during the first quarter. We shrink 31.4% during the second quarter, the worst quarter of our economic lives. And we recently received third quarter data, 33.1% to the upside. Now, as it turns out, the way the mathematics works, we're not completely recovered in terms of gross domestic product. The US economy is about 3% smaller now than it was a year ago. Nonetheless, a sort of a V-shaped recovery, and you can see that in many different ways. So the numbers are big. So big that on the previous chart, I had to bifurcate the axes, because if I try to graph a negative 31.4% or a 33.1% on one single axis, a lot of those vertical bars will simply disappear and, or at least shrink. But again, we had that vulnerability. We knew that coming into this pandemic, we had a lot of jobs that were going to be lost as we shut down the economy. We had some sense of who these people who were going to lose jobs might be. And so the numbers have been just dramatically big. This is monthly change in American jobs. So again, I've had to bifurcate the axes, which of course sounds and is quite painful. So the blue colored bars here stretch through February of 2020, and those blue colored bars are indexed to the left-hand axis. The right-hand axis includes March, April, May, June, July, August, September, and October. And those red bars, those months that I just mentioned, are indexed on the right-hand axis for reasons I'll get into, but are quite obvious. So we start the period of job loss with the 1.4 million jobs lost in March. I mean, through February, we had added jobs for 113 consecutive months. We had, as I say, driven unemployment nationally to 3.5%, a 50-year low. You'd have to go back to December of 1969 to find unemployment as low as it had been pre-crisis. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. That just gives you some sense of how long ago that was. It was historic. March, we lose 1.4 million jobs. In April, we lose 20.8 million jobs. So we had added 22 million jobs, ending with that 113-month period, ending with February of 2020. So over that 113-month period, 22 million jobs added. In March and April, we lose 22 million jobs. We give it all back. We didn't want to, but we did. And economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal were collectively predicting, and I'm not one of them, so these are mostly economists who work for large US financial institutions and some academics. But they collectively predicted that we'd lose 8 million jobs in May. But we didn't. We added 2.7 million jobs in May, followed by 4.8 million jobs in June, 1.8 million jobs in July, nearly 1.5 million jobs in August, 672,000 jobs in September, and 638,000 jobs in October. Pretty impressive. If you graph that 638,000 on the left-hand axis, it'd be a pretty lofty bar. And it really is a misreading in some sense, because that month in October, we let go of more than 100,000 temporary Census Bureau workers as that population count wound to a close. So if you add that back in, if you were to add that back in, we would have added close to 800,000 jobs. But pretty impressive stuff. The early phase of recovery has been quite vigorous. Now, don't get me wrong, we're nowhere close to complete recovery, which is why, of course, we're talking about more stimulus for the economy. Not just because COVID-19 is with us, not because the winter is looking somewhat bleak from a public health standpoint, but we've got a lot of room to go before we get back to where we had been, which is, of course, the aspiration, or one of them. So if you compare October 2019 data versus October of 2020 data, we're down 9.2 million jobs. 9.2 million jobs on a year-ago basis. Which sector has lost the most jobs over the past 12 months for TRIO data? Leisure and hospitality. Who is that? That's 3.3 million jobs lost. That's your restaurant worker and your hotel worker, precisely as the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis economists had predicted. Notice the second category here, however, government. And this is a reflection of the fact that many state and local governments have been battered financially, some places more than others. Orlando and Las Vegas, for instance, that depend more upon tourism taxes. In Maryland, revenues, if you're from Maryland, and you may not be, but if you're from my state, Maryland, then we've actually held up pretty well fiscally. We depend a lot on income tax collections, Well, a lot of high income earners have actually held on to their jobs. A lot of the jobs lost have been among near entry level and entry level folk who tend not to pay a lot in income taxes. I'm not saying I'm happy with that outcome. I'm just saying that that has fiscal implications. Retail sales tax collections have been pretty strong because retail sales have been pretty strong. More data on that in a moment. And property taxes, of course, the state doesn't depend very much on property taxes, as it turns out, in Maryland at least. But property taxes have held up pretty well because you've got that 3-year assessment cycle, so there's not immediate impact even if property values fall, which, by the way, in many instances they have not. Home prices have been rising, and I may have a chance to talk more about that as well. But again, I'm not suggesting to anyone here that even though the early stages of expansion have been quite brisk, that we're anywhere close to full recovery. Clearly, we are not. Some regional data. So this is employment growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. But it's really a mislabeled slide, isn't it? Because there is no growth here. Growth should be at least in quotation marks. That said, there are some regions which have lost a smaller fraction of their pre-existing employment base than others. So again, this is September 2019 versus September 2020. Which region has held on to the highest fraction of its jobs? Phoenix, Mesa, Scottsdale, Arizona. Who's the governor of Arizona? Doug Ducey. Doug Ducey has been one of these governors who's worked very hard to keep his economy open. The same can be said for Greg Abbott in Texas. You can see Dallas here at number 2. The same can be said for Brian Kemp, governor of Georgia. You can see Atlanta here at number 3. So some governors have been very fixated on the economic outcomes. Other governors have been focused on the public health outcomes. Again, I am not suggesting that one approach is better than another. But who has the highest proportionate job loss here? At number 25, the New York metropolitan area. Who's the governor of New York? Happens to be a guy named Andrew Cuomo. And of course, New York emerged as an early stage viral epicenter. So they really shut things down aggressively. Who's the governor of California? You can see San Francisco here at number 24. That's Gavin Newsom. Handsome gentleman, himself could be a Hollywood actor, but very aggressive in keeping that economy shut down. So San Francisco, Los Angeles, Riverside, San Diego, with relatively high proportions of job loss. You might say to me, Anirban, I see a contradiction here. At number 6, I see Tampa Bay. That's Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. But at number 20, I see Orlando. Same governor, same policy environment. What's going on here? This is the structure of economies. So what's Orlando about? Orlando is about leisure, hospitality, retail, trade. So there's an admixture of things going on here. Public health outcomes, public policy, and of course the structure of regional economies. What about unemployment? So as I say, we come into the crisis with a 3.5% rate of unemployment. By April, we're at 14.7%. Now here I'm showing you some additional granularity. The total unemployment rate is in red, men are in blue, women are in green. And in general, women have suffered more during this downturn than have men, and in fact, by a long shot. During the previous economic downturn, the Great Recession, men were battered by job losses, disproportionately battered by job losses in manufacturing and construction. Construction lost about 2.3 million jobs over the course of its downturn, and that's an 87% male industry. But this time around, it's been daycare centers, salons, private schools, retail, leisure hospitality, so on and so forth, sectors that tend to engage women more intensely, and that's where we've lost the jobs. And then in September, we saw the following phenomenon. A lot of women dropped out of the labor force, hundreds of thousands of them, probably because their kids were going back to school, but remote learning. And so, and this is even for first grade, second grade, third grade, so on and so forth. So one of the parents at least had to stay home, and often that turned out to be the woman, the mother. So mothers have left the labor force much more aggressively than have fathers, though fathers also on net left the labor force in September. Okay, in any case, 14.7% unemployment rate overall in April, but by October, we're back down to 6.9%, still high. But again, you can see the progress that has been made. If you flip this line upside down, and why would you do that? It's because less is more here, right? The lower the number here, the better. So if you flip this line upside down, you would again see evidence of that V-shaped recovery. This is unemployment rates for the 25 largest metropolitan areas. Where do we see the lowest rate of unemployment? St. Louis, Missouri, among these 25 communities. Who's the governor of Missouri? A guy named Mike Parson. Again, very aggressive in keeping that economy open. The most open economy, as it turns out, is South Dakota's. which, by the way, is one of the places where we see the most viral infection on a per capita basis. Again, perhaps coincidence, but perhaps not. The most shut down economy has been Hawaii's. Hawaii has been the most restrictive in terms of visitation and dealing with its own population. So again, add mixture of factors shaping these data. Where do you see the highest rate of unemployment? Los Angeles, governor there? Yep, Gavin Newsom, as I've said earlier. So you see also high unemployment in a number of California communities. No surprise, again, this is the public policy shaping the economic outcomes. What about wages and salaries? So predictably, with many firms looking to cut costs, trying to raise cash because they're nervous, they want to increase their available cash to protect themselves, growth in wages and salaries is not what it had been coming into the crisis. That's predictable. So we've lost jobs, and wages and salaries are not growing as rapidly as they once were. So it's amazing that retail sales have bounced back the way they have. So let's do some rewinding here to explain what's going on with this significant part of the economy, retail sales. So, okay, we shut down the economy in March and April. And you'll remember the CARES Act was passed on March 27th. And that was a $2.2 trillion package. That was the $1,200 check to certain individuals. That was a paycheck protection program. And that was also stepped up unemployment insurance benefits, with some people receiving $600 a week in federal unemployment insurance supplements to their state unemployment insurance benefits. So money is pouring into certain households. I understand there's a narrative that suggests that many people can't make the rent, they're facing eviction. True. I understand, and you understand, that there's greater food insecurity in America. More people are having to go to food pantries. True. But there's another group of households that have been able to actually stockpile cash over the course of the crisis. And they were doing that in the spring as this $1,200 check comes in, or the payment comes in electronically, so on and so forth, and stepped up unemployment insurance benefits. But they can't really spend the money. Economy shut down. Can't go to the mall, can't go to restaurants, can't go to the movie theater, and there's only so much Grubhub you can order. So, retail sales, which had begun to slope in February as COVID-19 was starting to permeate our lives, really fell off the table in March and April. And then what do you see here? By May, a bounce back. Because as we start to reopen the economy, that saved up cash starts hitting the economy. And indeed, by June, retail sales are above their pre-recession highs. And then you can see further spending growth in July, August, and September. Pretty strong September. And here comes the holiday shopping season. So that available cash hits the holiday shopping season, and you might see some pretty aggressive spending in October and November into December. So that's good. This has been one of the, I think, the surprising aspects of the economy. What about inflation? So coming into the crisis, inflation was benign. So benign that even though we were at a 50-year low in unemployment, the Federal Reserve managed to cut rates 3 times last year, the so-called mid-cycle adjustment, turned out to be a late-cycle adjustment. And you can see that over the course of the crisis, if you look at the end of the series here, this is the Consumer Price Index, or core CPI. It's a prominent measure of inflation. But you can see that, generally speaking, inflation has been in decline. We've had disinflation, and that through September, year-over-year inflation was around 1.7%, which is meaningfully below the Federal Reserve's 2% target. So they feel quite comfortable keeping interest rates low and keeping their balance sheet massive, and monetary policy will remain accommodative. Now, one of the implications of low inflation is low interest rates. Now, interest rates have been bouncing a bit higher recently. And we had that massive announcement by Pfizer on Monday, that was November 9th, suggesting that, they're making progress in their phase 3 clinical trials. We also have Moderna, Vir Pharmaceuticals, some others in phase 3 clinical trials or approaching phase 3 clinical trials. Johnson & Johnson has made some progress in its research with respect to a vaccine. So there's that. And of course, one of the reasons the markets have been surging this week is because of that Pfizer announcement and the excitement over that, the notion that we could actually liberate this economy and really have a very aggressive V-shaped recovery at some point going forward. But again, generally speaking, interest rates are still low, and there's many implications to this. And one of them is rising home prices, because mortgage rates are low. It shouldn't surprise anyone in this audience that home prices were rising prior to the crisis. Well, of course they were. The inventory of unsold homes was low, demand was pretty high, the economy was good, adding more jobs, more people earning more money, and mortgage rates low. So, the formula was in place. What is arguably surprising is that, we're down 9.2 million jobs on a year ago basis. Unemployment is double what it was. And we've got a lot of people facing, eviction and so on and so forth. So what might be arguably surprising is that the pace of home price appreciation has accelerated over the course of the crisis. That is somewhat remarkable to me. And again, mortgage rates have fallen during much of the crisis. That's one. But second, more people want a social distance. A lot of people want extra space for that home office because they want to look good on GoToWebinar. I'm trying here. And then there's demographics at work because we have the millennials coming of age, and many of them are now in their 30s or approaching their 30s. So prime first-time home buying years. The issue there, of course, is that the inventory of unsold homes is low. And so when you've got strong demand and quite weak supply, prices tend to rise, and that's what you see on this chart. And that fuels further sets of economic activity, including supply-side response. So this is U.S. residential building permits. It's a leading indicator of residential construction. Got to pull a permit before you can build something. So you can see a surge in residential building permits coming into 2020. Well, of course, home builder confidence was at a 20-year high late last year. Home builders could see what was happening. More people thinking about buying a home, taking advantage of those low mortgage rates, starting families, but the inventory of unsold homes in the suburbs, especially, quite low. So this was an opportunity for home builders to meet unmet demand. Then you can see a decline in permitting activity early in the crisis. And then what do you see here? A sharp bounce back in permitting activity. So I've shown you a few metrics here. Where it's been a V-shaped recovery. I've shown you job growth. I've shown you the GDP numbers for the third quarter, for instance. I've shown you the rate at which unemployment has declined. I've shown you, going back a couple of slides here, I've shown you, retail sales here. Again, if you use your imagination, you can see the letter V there if you look at the last few bars here. And then I'm showing you residential building permits, same thing, sort of V-shaped, again, if you use your imagination. Pretty aggressive. And, I would argue to you, not that we're arguing, but that the previous decade was about the American cities. It was about millennials moving into large American cities. They want to be part of the deepest labor markets in the country because they watched what happened to folks in 2008, 2009. They know that job loss was possible. So if you're going to lose a job, you might as well be in a market where it's easy to find the next job. So they wanted to be in the deepest labor markets possible. That meant big U.S. cities and large metropolitan areas, and often renting apartments. But this decade, I would argue to you, will be about the suburbs. It'll be about those millennials who've been paying high rents in those city apartments, moving to the suburbs. Now, they might move to a condominium in the city and so on and so forth. But the game here for many of them is to own something, to be part of the ownership society. So that is ultimately because a lot of the buying opportunities are in the suburbs, and a lot of the places where you can have a home office and 2 bedrooms are in the suburbs. That's what you're going to generally see, that migration to the suburbs in many, many communities, including the Washington metropolitan area and in the Baltimore metropolitan area. And then finally, the stock market had been such a brilliant performer prior to the crisis. Here I've got the Dow Jones index to the right, the NASDAQ and the S&P to the left. It's been remarkable, hasn't it? The Dow Jones sitting at 29,475.73 as I'm speaking to you right now. It changes every second. But really quite remarkable. What a rally. And I hope you've enjoyed that rally and were able to participate in it. Is the market presently overvalued? I don't know. I feel like it could be. There does seem to be a misadjustment or a malalignment between, or lack of alignment between, the performance of the broader economy. I mean, COVID-19 is spiking. And governors trying to shut down economies, and yet the stock market is going up like there's no tomorrow. So, and even the NASDAQ is up today. The NASDAQ had been down earlier this week as people rotate out of those big technology stocks into more mundane stocks. The notion being that big tech benefited from the pandemic in many instances, Amazon and many others, Zoom, DocuSign, but that if the economy goes back to quote unquote normal, where we're sort of in one another's presence once again, that sort of those cyclical stocks, those retailers, airlines, so on and so forth, hotels will bounce back. So we've seen some money coming out of technology into those mainline stocks. But in any case, really aggregate from an aggregate perspective, the Nasdaq is still sitting at 11,783 as I'm speaking to you. So really quite remarkable, especially given that we still have some vulnerabilities in this economy. So, another Tom Hanks movie, The Money Pit, and we have been throwing a lot of money into that pit we call the national debt. The national debt came into this crisis at $23.5 trillion. It's now over $27 trillion. Should you be concerned by this? I think you should be. Well, unless you're moving to Canada, this is your problem. It's my problem too. So this comes from the Congressional Budget Office. The dark blue colored bars here represent the federal budget deficit as a percentage of GDP for the next 10 fiscal years. It's a forecast. Now, last federal fiscal year, which ended on September 30th, so fiscal year 2020, America ran a $3.1 trillion federal budget deficit, $3.1 trillion for the year. Think about how much economic activity it takes to generate $3.1 trillion in revenue, a lot of economic activity. That was our federal budget deficit. That equated to 15.2% of GDP. And you can see here that for the next decade to come, the Congressional Budget Office believes that we'll continue to run massive deficits as a share of GDP, and that's if we don't have any further stimulus, which undoubtedly we will. Household debt, very elevated. Here I'm showing you various flavors of household debt: mortgage in orange, credit card in blue, student loans in red. The largest form of household debt or consumer debt is mortgage, followed by student loans. You can see that red sliver there through the slide. You can see how significant student loans have become in terms of their share of aggregate debt, and now around $1.5 trillion of outstanding student debt. So, our government is indebted. We are indebted, on average, at least many of us are. Corporate America is indebted. So, Anirban, you just showed that slide with that booming stock market. Corporate earnings have been strong, and we cut corporate tax in late 2017. Why are you showing this? Because this is reality. Because, yes, companies have had a lot of cash in recent quarters, it's true, and you can do a lot with that cash, including paying down debt, but you might not. Let's say this. Let's say I'm Oprah Winfrey and you are part of a live studio audience. And I've just interviewed Tom Cruise because he's in love again. And then I say, it's the end of the show, everyone. Hey, look under your chairs, $40,000. You get to keep that, $40,000. And then you'd see like, wow, this is a great show. I love Oprah. And there's a lot of things you could do with that $40,000, including paying down debt. But you can also use it as a down payment on your C8 Corvette, which is what I would do. So a lot of companies leverage up their cash flow to buy back their shares, to drive up earnings per share, right? You reduce the number of shares outstanding, earnings per share goes up. When earnings per share goes up, that tends to drive up the share price. That's beautiful, but you're left with a more leveraged corporate balance sheet. And also, if you're buying a leading competitor or the newest technology company with the latest platform, that would also tend to drive up debt to the extent that such deals are financed with debt, and they often are. So, again, the fact that the stock market is booming, that the economy is sort of getting through all these headwinds, right? Concerns about debt, the fact that COVID-19 is coming back with a vengeance has never really gone away. I think it's pretty remarkable. Nonetheless, I would argue to you that economic expansion has certainly been sullied. It was fabulous coming into the year, but we were hit with this massive supply shock of a caliber unknown in modern times. I want to be clear. To simplify their understanding of this crisis, a lot of economists have compared COVID-19 and its economic implications to previous events that created other times of U.S. economic stress. So I've heard many economists compare this to October of 1987 from a stock market perspective. I've heard many compare this to 9/11. I've heard some compare this to Hurricane Katrina's effect on New Orleans in 2005. And of course, many have compared this to 2008, 2009. Most of that is sheer nonsense. And I'm sure you recognize that. I'll give you an example. 2008, 2009 was a demand shock. What happened? The money disappeared. From where? Everywhere. Value of people's homes, value of their portfolios, bank balance sheets, insurance company balance sheets. The air came out of the balloon. So what did we do? We put air back in the balloon. We had the Troubled Assets Relief Program that we passed in late 2008 to recapitalize the banks. We passed a stimulus package under President Obama in February of 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of that year. The Federal Reserve took its interest rates basically down to 0% and then took its balance sheet from $800 billion Great Recession to $4.5 trillion during that crisis, injecting trillions of dollars of money supply into the economy. And you could argue it worked because that fashioned the lengthiest economic expansion in American history and did not trigger problematic inflation. But this is not a demand shock. This is a supply shock. We shut down the economy, quarantines, travel bans. You don't get to go to Hawaii. You don't get to go to Towson Town Center. Factory closures, supply chain disruptions. It really didn't matter how much momentum we had coming into this crisis. You shut down the economy recedes, you're in recession. Now, as you shut down the economy and you lose 20.8 million jobs in April, of course, that triggers a follow-on demand shock, of course, because people lose confidence and in many cases, people lose income. Now, again, we've seen some progress here. This is initial claims for unemployment insurance. The peak there is the week ending March 28th. That week, we had 6.9 million people file for unemployment insurance. But during the week ending October 31st, the initial claims was 751,000. Now, if you're a glass half full person, you say, Anirban, this is great, love it. I love these Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston webinars. They're so uplifting. But if you're a glass half empty person, you look at this and you say, before the crisis, that blue segment is the pre-crisis. We had about 210,000 people filing for unemployment insurance in any given week. Now it's 751,000. That's almost, 4 times. But this is not the entire story. This is a reflection of how many people are losing their jobs and therefore filing for unemployment insurance, those initial claims. But what we might care about macroeconomically is also continuing claims. Right? How many people are actually on unemployment insurance? Now this peaks, you can see here during the spring at 25 million. But during the week ending October 24th, the advanced figure for seasonally adjusted insured unemployment was around 7.3 million, a decline of more than 500,000 from the previous week. And you can see some progress here. Again, if you flip this line upside down, you might see the letter V for vibrancy, vitality, not necessarily victory. But for those of us economists who thought it was going to be V-shaped, vindication. I've shown this slide to you at a previous webinar for Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, so I won't spend a lot of time. But you see all these lines going up and down. A lot of this, all this means is that if you look at the blue line, for instance, the blue line is Hong Kong, SARS 2003, that line that goes right to the top and back down again. And what this basically says is that advanced societies tend to come back quickly from supply shocks like pandemics. SARS 2003 Hong Kong. So, because it was a supply shock, we shut down the economy and then we reopened it. And I get it. It's not so simple. We didn't completely shut it down, and nor did we completely reopen it. But as an approximation, that's basically what happened. So we've had that sharp bounce back in economic activity, unlike after the Great Recession, that financially induced demand shock. We tend to come back slowly from financial shocks. The same thing was true in the Great Depression. Right? Stock market crashes in 1929. It took us many years to come out of that. That was a demand shock. But supply shocks, different. And one of the reasons for that V-shaped recovery is that governments don't just sit by and watch as people are plagued by the plague. They respond with stimulus. Now we've had 4 rounds of stimulus thus far. The big one here is phase 3, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, the $2.2 trillion package. But note, the last major stimulus passed by Congress was in April. That was nearly 7 months ago. Those unemployment insurance supplements from the federal government, that ended with July. The Paycheck Protection Program ended in August. So this economy now is marching naked into the winter, not wearing any stimulus, as these infection rates skyrocket. Now, as it turns out, I'm not that worried about the demand side of the economy. And I'll talk about why that is in a second. But again, what about future stimulus to stimulate demand even further? So here's where the election stands. I think Joe Biden is the president-elect, I think. But one of the keys here is who's going to control the Senate. Now, as of right now, the Republicans have 50 senators. The Democrats have 46, but 2 senators, 2 independents, Angus King of Maine, and then Bernie Sanders of Vermont are independents. They caucus with the Democrats. So it's effectively 50 Republicans and 48 Democrats. Cal Cunningham, the Democratic senatorial candidate in North Carolina, has now conceded. So Senator Tom Tillis keeps that Senate seat out of North Carolina. But we've got these runoff races in Georgia. So the Democrats, if they can win the 2 runoff races in Georgia, get to 50 senators, and then, of course, Kamala Harris becomes the 51st vote. So the incumbent David Perdue, Republican, faces challenger John Ossoff, and then the incumbent Kelly Loeffler faces challenger Raphael Warnock. for the other special election in Georgia. So Georgia will be the center of the political world for the next month or so. The most recent poll by the right-leaning Remington Research Group shows that Loeffler, the Republican, has a 49 to 48% lead over Raphael Warnock, so it is a dead heat. And that David Perdue has a 50 to 46% lead, probably within the margin of error. Now, ignore the stuff on the right here. It merely suggests that during runoff elections, Republicans tend to do quite well. So we'll see what that means. But if we get a 50-50 Senate, the Democrats have the majority, and you might say to me, Anirban, what does that mean? That means that Joe Biden is going to be able to shove through tax increases, so on and so forth. Not so fast. Because you've got one senator out there, a guy named Joe Manchin out of West Virginia, who bills himself as a conservative Democratic senator. And he has basically said, in fact, I think he said it yesterday on Fox News, I will not allow progressives to run crazy in Washington, D.C. So yes, you might have 50-50, but you've got Joe Manchin out there who becomes perhaps the most important senator in the Senate because he is in some sense a swing vote. Now again, as I suggested, I'm not that worried in the months ahead about the demand side of the economy. It's the US savings rate. The savings rate starts the crisis at around 8%. By April, the big peak there is 33%. This is savings as a percentage of personal disposable income. So while some families can't pay rent, there are other families who have been stockpiling cash. And indeed, as late as September, the savings rate was still a lofty 14.3%. That's like storing nuts for the winter. So this cash can still hit the economy, that spending side of the economy in November, December into 2021. So what am I worried about as a macroeconomist? Not the demand side. And again, remember, this was not a demand shock to begin with. This was a supply shock. So what am I worried about? Yep, the supply side of the economy. Look, I mean, in some sense, it's been a beautiful day in the neighborhood. We've had a surprisingly vigorous, at least to many economists, surprisingly vigorous initial phase of recovery. If you were with me during my first Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston webinar, this is a quote from that first webinar, this first bullet. I said, the initial phase of recovery from the crisis will be sharp, profound, and most welcome. It's on tape. That's exactly what it has been. As people re-engaged the economy, they found low interest rates. Pent-up demand was high. There was a need to rebuild inventories, which is why manufacturing output has been surging recently in America as we replenish those inventories. And of course, we're social creatures, so we want to go to casinos and see a movie and restaurants and all the rest of it, watch the Orioles. For those of us economists who thought it was going to be V-shaped, May's jobs report was the win. Because we didn't lose 8 million jobs, as some had predicted. We added 2.7 million, and then June was even better, 4.8 million jobs added. Fantastic. But then while we've been adding jobs in July through October, in general, the pace of job creation has been softening because the stimulus has worked its way through the economy and now it's drying up. So while the recovery has begun, these remain treacherous times, obviously. I don't think we haven't yet earned an enduring V-shaped recovery. We haven't fully flattened the curve. In fact, quite the opposite. We don't yet have a vaccine. Come on, Pfizer and Moderna, let's get this thing done. And so my baseline prediction is we'll have another recession this winter, and that will induce the president, who's inaugurated in January, and the newly seated Congress to have a very large stimulus package, even if we have still divided government between the presidency and the Senate. And so expect that. And then if we get that vaccine come the spring from Pfizer, Moderna, et cetera, watch out. The latter half of 2021 could be explosive in terms of growth, unlike anything we've ever seen. We could bounce back very quickly. But until then, I see some bleakness during the winter months. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marty for Q&A.
Thank you, Anirban. One question I have is, how would a second lockdown be different from the first one we experienced? And how does a recovery look different from where we were when this all started?
Right. So I think another lockdown we tend to be less vicious because we're more able to live with this, right? So we now know that we can get food through Grubhub, supply chains are now in place, 37% of Americans can work remotely, we can still have these Zoom meetings and business can still operate. That said, you can imagine how much financial fatigue there is among retailers, restaurateurs, hoteliers, airlines. Right? They've lost a lot of money, and if you don't have further stimulus for those kinds of companies, some of them are going to go belly up, which will produce another set of job losses. So not as severe as we saw in April, perhaps, but problematic, given that we're starting at a high level of unemployment already. Coming into that first shutdown, of course, unemployment was at that 50-year low. Now, with respect to the recovery, this first recovery, as I say, V-shaped, has been a constrained recovery. What do I mean by that? We didn't get full recovery in the restaurant sector. We didn't get full recovery in the cruise ship industry, the airline industry, and many others, the theme park industry, because we were still social distancing, wearing masks and trying to stay 6 feet apart. And so some industries were not allowed to really come back fully. But if you get a vaccine and sufficient herd immunity, then what happens? All of a sudden, you get an unconstrained expansion. And if I'm right that you also get a major stimulus coming out of the new administration in Washington, D.C., that, along with this unconstrained recovery, means phenomenal growth rates at some point in 2021. So it's going to feel even better. So I would say the next recession will be a bit shallower, and the next recovery will be even more aggressive.
One of the industries we've touched upon was real estate, talking about residential and the boom in residential. But I think at our last webinar, we talked about the prospect of a commercial real estate slowdown, maybe 12 months out. Do you still see that as a likelihood about a year out?
Oh, I think it's happening now. I think commercial real estate is in crisis in much of the country. Why wouldn't it be? Hotel occupancy rates have been down, so their finances, in many cases, have been shattered. This is especially true, I think, for independent hotel operators who can't just go to capital markets and borrow more money. I'm not talking about Hilton or Marriott. I'm talking about those, that person who has done very well for themselves as an entrepreneur, owns 2 or 3 or 4 hotels, among the wealthiest people in their communities, but now, of course, their hotels have been generating significant losses over the last few months. Maybe they got some stimulus money, that's true, that helped out, but a lot of that money has probably run out. So, I'm talking about, office space. So a lot of people during the previous cycle moved from Class B office space to Class A office space. They could do that because the economy was good. It also makes the CEO feel good, makes the board feel good to be in that nice space, but it was also used as a recruitment and retention tool. Because if you're trying to recruit the best and brightest college graduates or people coming out of graduate school, whether law school or other schools, then you want to have nice office space. So when they come in for the interview, they say, oh, this is a success address. I want to be here. Can I take a selfie here, send back to mom and dad? I'm going to take your job offer. But now, with us knowing that people can work remotely, in large numbers, and also be more productive in many instances, who needs so much expensive office space? And one of the groups that I think gets back in the game in some sense are owners of Class B office space. Some smartly tailored retrofitting. So improving their HVAC systems, for instance, because air handling systems can spread virus, improving their public spaces, including public restrooms, partitions from floor to ceiling, for instance, because you can't have 6 feet of separation in those contexts, getting rid of the air dryers, those hand air dryers in bathrooms, because that can spread virus, and instead having good old-fashioned but attractive paper towel dispensers. With these kinds of improvements, you might see some prime tenants moving back into Class B space, including, by the way, into suburbs, where there's a lot of vacant Class B space, because that's where the workforce is now moving. So, and then I shouldn't mention retail space, but when you've had the bankruptcy of Neiman Marcus, JCPenney, J. Crew, Pier 1 Imports, the parent company of Lane Bryant, obviously that leads to a lot of vacancy in that segment.
Now, somewhat overshadowed by the national election is some of the new laws passed in various states. And I think we had 4 states this go around that legalized recreational marijuana. And the first state in the mid-Atlantic to do so was New Jersey, which has passed full legalization of recreational marijuana. Do you see that as creating economic pressure on the surrounding states in the mid-Atlantic, including Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, to follow suit?
Not necessarily. I don't think it's pressure coming from them. I think the issue is that it's confusing for law enforcement when you don't change the law. So if law enforcement is told, on the one hand, if somebody's smoking marijuana, even in public, don't arrest them, don't waste your time, it's not worth it. But in fact, that's illegal activity as defined by state law, then you're confusing things. So what the New Jersey legislators did, the legislature did there, is they clarified. They said, it's legal, don't worry about it. You don't have to enforce that law, it doesn't exist anymore. Huh? And I think you're having some states moving toward legalizing all drugs beyond marijuana. So, we've come a long way. Some people might say we've come a long way in the wrong direction, but we've come a long way along this dimension. So I like that, actually. I like that people are trying to clarify the law and say, this is an enforceable law, this is the law, and this is not the law. So I think it's not pressure necessarily, it's just common sense, what New Jersey did. If in fact you're not going to punish people for using marijuana or even distributing it, then take the laws off the books and let people enforce the laws that actually exist.
Thank you. One thing we haven't talked about is subprime lending. Are you seeing any growing subprime lending crisis in the current situation?
Yeah, I'm really not seeing that subprime lending crisis because, as far as I can tell, Marty, lending standards are still pretty disciplined. So some people in the audience may have tried to refinance their mortgage recently, or trying to get purchase money mortgage to buy a property. And I went through that process. We just, my wife made me do it. It often happens that way. Forced me to buy a condominium in Orlando. And so I had to go through this mortgage process. And it's tough for me because I'm a small business owner. So we small business owners were self-employed, and so people look at us, in a funny way when we apply for credit. But in any case, what I saw from that process was that the lending standards are still pretty tough. That you've got to check a lot of boxes before you can access that capital. So I'm not so worried about the subprime lending. I will say what I am worried about is corporate junk debt. Because one of the things that the Federal Reserve has done is it's expanded its balance sheet and has been willing to buy up some pretty, what I would define as toxic corporate debt to try to support liquidity in U.S. corporate capital markets. And that's fine, but it means that you've got artificial support for this lowly ranked, not non-market rated debt. And so I'm worried about that we might be creating some artificial undue riskiness, some perverse incentives in that junk debt or junk bond market, but not so much worried about household subprime credit issues. Not right now, no.
We've talked several times about the V recovery. Do you think we're at risk of it going into a W recovery where we'll have a recession and then followed by another recovery? And if so, how long do you think that recession will be?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The V becomes a W. And we've had this nice period of economic bounce back, a partial bounce back. It's an awkward V. We haven't come back all the way back. In some cases, we have. Retail sales are all the way back. Permits are all the way back, residential building permits. But for the most part, jobs, unemployment, we're not all the way back. State government finances, we're not all the way back. But it's been a pretty brisk early stage of the recovery, but that V becomes a W. Because here we go again with another supply shock. Governors around the country, starting to shut things down, reverse reopenings. That happened in Maryland just yesterday. And then when you've got, let's say Joseph Biden is inaugurated on January 20th, and he is going to probably promulgate some rules to suggest that we're going to have even further shutdowns, but those are federally mandated. And they can do that with airports and some other facilities susceptible to federal regulation. So you put all that together, and we've got some issues in the short term. That V becomes a W. I'm very much looking forward to after spring 2021. I think that's when you're going to see really great times ahead for us in terms of really recovering. But the virus is still with us, and it's inescapable.
So one last question here before we wind up. So the Mid-Atlantic, particularly the DC market and the suburbs, the DC suburbs in Northern Virginia and in Maryland, are disproportionate employers of government, the government workforce. Do you see them as continuing to be insulated from the worst of this recovery, or are they going to have something different this time?
No, I think they're pretty much insulated, right? So, I doubt that the Biden administration is going to come in and try to cut down spending significantly. Now, there might be one exception there at least, that's defense contractors. Right? We've seen a huge increase in the defense budget by the Trump administration, right? $750, $800 billion a year in spending. I doubt that continues under a Biden administration. I doubt it. So that's one group of federal government contractors, those workers who might be somewhat vulnerable there, and that might affect some of the Department of Defense workers too. But I doubt you're going to see a major pullback in spending at housing and urban development or health and human services. I think you'll see more spending in those categories. And Homeland Security probably will continue to see lots of outlays directed towards them. So yeah, I think there's some insulation there still.
I'm going to ask one more question that came in. So what do you see as the sectors that are going to withstand this coming downturn the best, and then which ones are going to benefit from the revival the most in late spring?
Right. So big tech gets another push up, right? So If we start seeing more shutdowns, again, that's your Zoom. Zoom, by the way, recently had a market capitalization above Exxon's. That's how big Zoom has gotten, okay? And DocuSign and Amazon, of course. You know, I don't know if you saw the earnings report from the third quarter, but earnings growth has been phenomenal at Amazon. Well, these are some of the companies that will benefit if, in fact, I'm right that we have another set of shutdowns. But then next year, once we quote unquote go back to normal, right? We can go outside without wearing a mask and those kinds of things. Once we're vaccinated, or enough of us are vaccinated, then I think who benefits? I think there's significant pent-up demand in the travel sector. I think people are itching to take a vacation. They want to get on airplanes. They want to go to Hawaii. They want to stay in a hotel room. They want to go to a Disney theme park. So you're going to see those segments really bounce back. The cruise ship industry will be one of the big winners next year in terms of bounce back. Those kind of cyclical sectors of the economy. So watch for that, Marty. And I think that's where we're headed in 2021.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you sharing your insights with us today, Anirban.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you to Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston as well for creating the forum. And thanks to all of you for being here.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, Marty and Anirban. And thank you for everyone for attending today's webinar. Remember that you will receive a follow-up email with the link to view the recording of today's webinar. And also, if we did not happen to get to your question, please don't hesitate to reach out. Now, on behalf of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.